The Women's Suffrage Movement, A Fight for Equality by Sally Tazinski and Miriam Saradsky. The struggle to achieve women's right to vote was fought for and eventually achieved by influential American leaders, but the struggle to obtain all equal rights for men and women is still being fought for today. The idea of women's suffrage in America was first sparked by philosophers and thinkers in the Enlightenment era. America modeled England's fight in the 1820s for women's suffrage, or the right to vote. Industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries left women at home taking care of their houses and children, while men were busy working at factories. Stereotypes and realities about women staying at home increased. This angered women, who were as capable as men, and led them to form equal rights feminist groups to fight against the many restrictions society had on women. The first organized women's rights convention was held by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Women that attended the convention wanted the same rights and privileges that white male U.S. citizens had. At the convention, the women created and signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which most importantly changed the first line of the Declaration of Independence to, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." Two individual organizations were formed to fight for women's suffrage: the NWSA, or National Women's Suffrage Association, a more radical group, and the AWSA, or American Women's Suffrage Association, a more reserved group. In 1890, the two groups joined together as NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the suffragists. They held conventions, campaigns, speeches, and parades, and finally began to attract the attention of Americans. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an inspiring activist involved in the fight for women's suffrage, went to an all-boys school and tried to become a lawyer, but could not because she was a woman. She was active in the abolition and temperance movement, as well as the women's suffrage movement. Her whole life, Stanton strived to address all kinds of inequalities. Lucretia Mott, another important leader in the women's rights movement, spoke at meetings and conventions and was also involved in the temperance movement. Mott agreed with equality between men and women, but she did not fully agree with women having the right to vote. To convince Mott and all other Americans who did not agree with women's suffrage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony wrote a radical newspaper promoting women's rights called Revolution, and founded the National Women's Suffrage Movement in 1869. Susan B. Anthony promoted equality for all of her life. She was a teacher and joined the Daughters of Temperance. She wrote an important speech about women's suffrage, stating that it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the ballot. All over America, small and large groups of women began learning about the new political controversy of women's suffrage, and they started to take action. Stanton's cousin, Elizabeth Smith Miller, and Amelia Bloomer had a new idea that caused dress reform for all women. Soon, Bloomer's loose flowy pants became a new radical style. Both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were involved in the Anti-Slavery Society. By 1866, Stanton and Anthony had created AERA, the American Equal Rights Association, to combine the right to vote for African Americans and women. During the Civil War, women's suffrage was silenced, and some people involved in the abolition and suffrage movement thought that slavery needed to be addressed first. Members of the AERA that supported women's suffrage protested and petitioned Congress, but other members thought it would weaken the fight for black suffrage. Many feminists began to distance themselves from African American movements, making up racial slurs to distance themselves from these movements. Eventually, the AERA broke up, and both movements began individually competing to achieve their independent goals. In 1870, African American men were granted the right to vote, and both black and white women were shocked and began to fight harder for their goal. The suffragists used the 14th Amendment as one of their strongest arguments because it stated that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof have the right to vote at any election. Women strongly believed that they already had the right to vote. NWSA began encouraging women to stand up for their rights and vote at the election of 1872. On November 5, 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 14 other women demanded to vote and casted their ballots. On November 18th, Anthony was arrested for illegal voting, and on December 23rd, Anthony was tried at a court where she stated, "I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all U.S. citizens by the National Constitution."
Susan B. Anthony continued to vote at local elections, and meanwhile, her trial was being rescheduled for June 17th. The trial, which would reach the Supreme Court in June 1875, would determine whether or not the 14th and 15th Amendments already gave women the right to vote. Henry Selden was supposed to be Anthony's lawyer and defend her, but disagreed with her and ended up proving her guilty. Anthony's case was very controversial, and finally, in the case of Minor versus Happersett, the Supreme Court ruled that states would have the option to let women vote or not. In July 1908, the New York State Association opposed to women's suffrage published a newspaper, The Anti-Suffragist. The anti-suffragist movement was started by Massachusetts and New York in the 1890s, mainly by middle-class Protestant conservative women. Finally, in 1911, the National Association opposed to women's suffrage was created, and they published their own paper, The Women's Protest. They ended the anti-suffragists in 1912. Women were working 12 to 14-hour workdays with poor working conditions and little pay. Women were being segregated by gender too. Women wanted the right to vote so that they could change their working conditions and integrate genders. On March 3, 1913, Alice Paul held a NWSA parade that became a competition for attendance with President Wilson's inauguration. Many more parades followed in New York and D.C., where over 520,000 people would participate. By 1916, most American women supported the fight for the 19th Amendment, which would allow women to vote. By 1917, parades and pickets had become more violent, and many women were arrested, which continued to motivate American women. As America was on the brink of World War I, the anti-suffragists were trying to encourage women to stay home and support their families while husbands were at war. Soon, everyone realized that with the absence of men, women needed to be able to work and vote. By 1918, President Wilson could not resist women's suffrage any longer. Finally, the president publicly announced that he supported the 19th Amendment on January 9, 1918. Then, on June 4, 1919, the Senate passed the 19th Amendment. Finally, on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially passed, added to the Constitution. Women celebrated their victory all over the country. The success of women's suffrage was huge. Over 12 million votes were cast in the 1920 election compared to the 1916 election where women couldn't vote. Women were finally an active voice in the American government. Women gained more respect, freedom, and privileges from winning their long struggle for women's rights. More girls began attending and completing high school and college, and in 1921, the first Congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin from Wyoming, was elected. America's women's suffrage movement inspired other countries like Israel, who elected their first politically involved woman, Rishon Liaison, in the 1950s. Women supported African Americans once again during the Black Civil Rights struggle in the 1960s. Women proudly marched and protested to help African Americans finally get the rights they deserved.
Even in the 1980s, women continued their fight for equality.
As Felice Schwartz said in 1982, the success of female entrepreneurs garnered increasing attention, but many women still face a hostile workplace, but we no longer visualize her in a house dress. Her paycheck often supports the entire family. For the first time in the presidential election of 2008, a woman ran for president, another woman ran for vice president, and the first African American president was elected. Currently, many women still hold positions in the U.S. government. The White House Project is working hard to create the opportunity for a woman to be elected president in the next decade. Some countries like Lebanon and Saudi Arabia still do not let women have the right to vote. Also, in America today, women receive 77.5% of a man's paycheck, even if they have the same job, just because she is a woman. Americans will continue to fight for equal economic and political rights for all women and men until all Americans are completely equal no matter what gender they are. As an anonymous writer said, women still have a long way to go in U.S. politics, but important strides have been made and critical lessons learned.
As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses.